Of that, Justin has started recording the event and has spotlighted my video. So we're going to go ahead and transition from the informal pre-event conversation to the teach-in. And we've got a number of people who've joined us here on Zoom. We're also live streaming. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for the live stream. This is the second of our spring semester teach-in on democracy events. And it's particularly fitting that we're welcoming the speakers that we have today, because the idea for this teach-in came from an open meeting that we had with the campus community, primarily with students, in January following the failed insurrection at the US Capitol. People, on this campus just trying to make sense of what it means for us as an international policy, language, intercultural competence school, what role our students and graduates can play in supporting democracy and perfecting democracy. And it was during that meeting that one of our speakers, Nathaniel Sawyer, said, this school needs to do a better job of mobilizing its expertise to illuminate these issues and to illuminate the public debate on these issues. And that's part of the reason why we decided to do these lunchtime teach-in moments. And we are doing exactly what Nathaniel called upon us to do, which is to mobilize our expertise, the expertise in our MIIS network. And we have two very distinguished members of that network here as panelists today. It's my great pleasure to have the role in this meeting of introducing them. But first, I'll introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm Jeff Dayton Johnson. I'm the Dean of the Middlebury Institute, and I'm very proud of the network that we're drawing upon today. One current student, one former faculty member and good friend of the Institute will be talking on the subject of systemic racism. This is something that we've been talking about on this campus for a long time and with a renewed vigor, I would say, over the last 12 months. And we're looking forward to a very rich conversation today with our panelists and with those of you who are in attendance. So let me introduce the speakers. First is Nathaniel Sawyer, a fourth-year student, an MA in International Policy Development candidate, graduating at the end of this spring semester. Nathaniel, like many of our students, is a returned Peace Corps volunteer. He served in Ecuador. He has a number of interesting professional and personal experiences before joining us here in Monterey. But in his short time on the Monterey Peninsula, Nathaniel has really become a prominent voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. He has become a prominent voice in many community forums. Many schools seek Nathaniel out to speak to their students, whether they're K through 6, high school, and beyond K through 12. And I think the reason that he is so widely sought out by community organizations and groups and institutions is because of his commitment to social justice and equality, because of his eloquence, and because of his heart. And I believe you will see all three of those characteristics in the discussion which will follow. So we're very delighted to have Nathaniel with us. Our second panelist is State Senator Bill Monning. Bill Monning, I love to remind people, was for many years a faculty member here at the then Monterey Institute. Since that time, he has most recently served as a California state senator. He was the state Senate majority leader in that role. Prior to serving in the state Senate, he was California State Assembly member. He stepped down, or his term ended in December of last year. And since then, he's been looking for new challenges, I'm sure. And so we're here to challenge you today, Bill, in this discussion. Bill has expertise in conflict resolution. He has expertise in nuclear weapons and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. He has expertise in the law. He's a practicing lawyer. There are a number of professional and personal passions that Bill has been able to share with our students. And I'm delighted that here he is again today, working with our students on issues which are dear to us and important to him. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to our speakers. They'll have a set of comments, and then we will open up the discussion to Q&A. And it looks like our speakers have been highlighted. So welcome, Bill. Welcome, Nathaniel. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. And I want to personally say before me and Bill start talking that you are an example of what a leader should be in an institution. You know, we've had our battles together as me causing a little good trouble at the Institute. And every single time something has came up, you have handled it with grace, perseverance, and true humble character. And I truly appreciate that about you. And I look forward to the hearts you will touch in the future with the future generations here at MIIS. Me and Bill aren't strange to each other. I've seen him personally march beside me in Marina and in other areas. I've seen him come to Martin Luther King events in Seaside, and we personally talked over phone and Zoom. Me and Bill are good examples of, I think, how you, as activists and politician, now retired politician, can coexist. When most people watch movies or read about politicians and activists, they see the negativity, the arguments. And yes, me and Bill may disagree on some things at times, but I respect his wisdom. Like he said before we started this Zoom call, he has a lot of gray hair, which gave him a lot of wisdom. So so good afternoon, Bill. As you know, it's Black History Month. And I would like to say, in honor of Black History Month, power to the people, Black Lives Matter, Viva la Revolution. Many speak of the civil rights movement as the end to racism, discrimination, and microaggressions, but it was not. The civil rights movement, which ended in 1968, was fighting for equal employment, housing, education, as well as the right to vote, the right to equal access to public facilities, and the right to be free of racial discrimination. We may not be drinking from different water fountains, sitting in the back of the bus, using different restrooms in schools and universities, but we have not shed the mentality of racism out of our system. We are free in name, but not in practice. Today, we are still fighting for equal employment in the Black communities. We have the redlining and gerrymandering in cities to oppress the Black communities from owning homes in the more affluent areas. Our children are educated at the kindergarten level on the court system, being taught it is their fault their life is either moving towards incarceration, to be shot by a cop, death, drugs, or gangs. My main mission in life as a human being is to negotiate, demonstrate, and resist. I say negotiate, demonstrate, and resist until more voices of the disadvantaged are protected from discrimination in the school and employment systems. Until there is better healthcare representation of Black community in the classrooms, doctor offices, universities, and businesses, I am tired of seeing Black Lives Matter on mission statements and no actions towards helping Black lives. On a good day, I promote peace as MLK, but I am 27 and part of the young rural revolutionaries of today. And right now you are speaking to someone with the mentality of Fred Hampton and Malcolm X. We have been turning our cheeks since Emmett Till. African Americans are the only people who are supposed to be peaceful while people hang us, beat us, incarcerate us, stereotype, separate, and degrade us. Today is a real historic raw conversation, and I'm honored to be able to have this frank and open discussion with you. My first question to you is, what are your thoughts on systemic racism in the US? Also, feel free to talk about what California has done in the fight against systemic racism.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. I also want to thank Jeff Dayton Johnson and the Middlebury Institute, the support staff helping out today, and just for the commitment to creating this space for this type of dialogue and focus and continued work. Nathaniel, I want to thank you for the very powerful and insightful opening comments, and I too have enjoyed our friendship, our partnership, getting to know each other, and I've taken great inspiration from your passion and your energy. It gives me hope for the future. You acknowledge the gray beard and the gray hairs, and I said earlier, that's what I tell my grandchildren are signs of wisdom. They're earned. But on a more serious note, in direct response to your question about systemic racism, some positioning. I grew up in a privileged background in Southern California, the son of a father who was a civil servant. We were middle class modest, but we had everything we needed. And the most important thing I had was access to a good quality education that led me to UC Berkeley, led me to law school, and led me to pathways and life choices where I could make informed decisions to advance my own development. And it probably wasn't until I got to Berkeley as an undergraduate in the heat of the anti-war movement, the heat of the prison movement in California, that even the term white skin privilege was even used, and the study and analysis of the roots of systemic racism. And when we break down that word of systemic racism, the word system, what is the system we're talking about? We're talking about an economic, a political, and a social system that we've grown up in that has roots in the enslavement of people, in the mistreatment of people of color, and the exploitation of people of color for economic reasons. And then it spills over into social relationships and affects every sector. When we talk about systemic racism, a lot of the focus of Black Lives Matter, understandably, has been police abuse, police brutality, excessive use of force, police killings of unarmed people. And so what I'll comment on through our conversation are some of the, I think, strides we've made in state legislation and state law focused on the criminal justice system and police practices. But when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about inequality and inequity in education, in healthcare, in economic opportunity. And so it's all pervasive in the social fabric that we live within. Nathaniel, you alluded to the civil rights movement and making it illegal to have segregated drinking water systems, segregated restaurants, segregated bathrooms, in the vestiges of Jim Crowism. But with the elimination of so-called legal segregation, we have yet to overcome the systemic racism that's embedded in the system and systems that we live under. I think for me, the optimism comes from realizing that these systems that have been unequal were created by human beings and they can be changed by human beings, and that some of the openings that we've seen in decades, in generations, have opened doors to education and healthcare. We're just not there yet. Now, I guess I'll just close this part of kind of the opening of our conversation to say that in this country, there has never been a reckoning with the history of enslavement of people and the vestiges of that enslavement that continue to permeate inequality and disparate treatment in our society and our culture. And we need only look to the experience of the people of South Africa under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who engaged in a truth and reconciliation process that brought together victims of the apartheid system face to face with police who brutally treated and in many cases killed family members of those they faced in the truth and reconciliation process. It was a painful process, but it put front and center the history of apartheid and disparate treatment and racism in South Africa that laid the groundwork for a healing process that continues today. We've never embarked on such a truth and reconciliation process in the United States. And I think it's not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the people who at the community level, at the state level, and hopefully eventually at the national level, figure out the ways to bring people together to confront this vicious history of systemic racism and begin to work together in the building blocks to move forward. And I'll just close saying, The leadership has come from the Black Lives Movement in recent years, from leaders in the Latino, the Asian American communities. And there's often a question, I think, for white folk, what's our appropriate role? And I'll just close. Our appropriate role is to be informed allies. And you become informed allies through study, through engagement, and through the ability to look at the open wounds that systemic racism have left in this country.
Bill, I think the key towards eradicating racism is different perspectives and mindsets. The U.S. is running the way, honestly, the U.S. is running the way it's supposed to run. And racism has been mixed in this country's DNA since the first man landed on this country's dirt and started stealing land and raping women and bringing slaves, calling us property. Today, people need to be looking forward and not allow mindsets of the past to dictate a future that will show more diversity and integration they have lived through. I don't believe you can ask policy specialists and politicians like yourself to eradicate racism without being knowledgeable of history and different cultures. In my honest opinion, the Trump administration was the far right and ignorant right-wing attempts to hold on towards the resemblance of white supremacy. Former President Trump and the people pulling his strings did exactly what they came to do, which was divide us further, build more systemic racism policies, and keep racism alive for the sake of the new conservative party. In all honesty, the Capitol riots, in my opinion, could not have been prevented because Trump educated racists on the facts Black and brown people were becoming stronger in our society. Many far-right individuals were ignorant to our existence and power until Trump. I'm going to ask you a question about, do you believe the Capitol riots could have been prevented? But before I jump into that, I'm the first in my family to graduate high school. Like, my mom went to school when they were starting to put white people together in schools in Alabama. That's where I'm originally from. That's why sometimes I have a Southern twang. I had to read for my uncles, their mail, when I was in first grade. I remember being held back in kindergarten because my mom couldn't afford to take me back and forth to school. I remember failing sixth grade math with a 58% before President Bush Jr. signed the No Child Left Behind law and stuff. I'm saying all this stuff because I have a master's degree now, I'm going to get a PhD, things like that. I am a leader in the community, but I stand on the backs of those who came before me. And it's been difficult. I've seen how I thought at the beginning education was the key towards, solving systemic racism when I was young, or racism in general. Systemic racism was not even thinking about until I educated myself further and realized things that have happened in the past are now embedded into a system that we haven't yet to talk about. So, right now everybody's talking about the Capitol riots and they're so surprised by it, but I'm not. I don't know. I'm numb to it too. When I saw it, I wasn't even shocked. And what do you say about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate you sharing some of your family's background, getting to know you. I've learned a little bit about your facing the odds and rising above the odds in many cases, and your trajectory that brought you to Monterey Institute, Middlebury Institute, and on now to a doctoral program. But you've overcome a lot to get to where you are today. In response to your question, the January 6th uprising, I call it the attempted coup d'etat. We learn a lot from that. The people that led that are self-proclaimed proud white supremacists. They are seen as the base and the core of the so-called Trump base or Trump movement. His election in 2016 was in large measure his playing to the disaffection of white people in this country, fear of immigrants and immigration, and really a backlash to 8 years of stellar leadership of the first African-American president in this country. And the white supremacy piece of January 6th, if we study systemic racism, you can't talk about systemic racism without talking about white supremacy, white skin privilege. But the white supremacist movement, I believe, rises from fear and ignorance It rises from people being directed to see those who threaten them as people of color versus a system that perhaps exploits them economically as well. And so just as the January 6th insurrection was eventually thwarted, those forces don't disappear. And with the election of Joe Biden, the forces that gave rise to a Donald Trump do not disappear and go away. The divisions are going to remain deep in this country, and I fear the former president will continue to provoke that base to gain whatever foothold he can or whatever platform he can to continue to promote himself. That said, I think it's incumbent upon us to see the political system as one that in its essence and perfection is created for people to be able to have voice in a representative democracy, for people to be able to organize around issues and policies and see government serving their interest. And while there's a lot of disaffection with government and with politicians, I had the privilege of serving in Sacramento, where hard-fought victories led to majorities in both houses of the Assembly and the Senate. And we have passed policy measures that are now law in the state of California that have sought to bridge the divide in communities economically, in terms of access to health care. And just to comment on a couple of gains on the criminal justice front, during my tenure in the Senate and kind of parallel, maybe a little before the rise of the Black Lives Movement, progressives were already working to close the Department of Juvenile Justice, the incarceration of young teens and younger, slotting them into a prison system with no way out, to now the closure of the 3 juvenile prisons in California, in engaging communities to provide the support necessary for youngsters with run-ins with the law, with the criminal justice system, and to see the pathway out is through education, therapy, and family support where possible. That was Senate Bill 823. That was, and I'll just mention a couple more. Governor Newsom, on his own initiative, has suspended imposition of the death penalty that we know historically, not just in California, but nationally, has been a racistly biased, exercise of the ultimate exercise of taking someone's life. That is suspended now in California. The use of deadly force by police, who have often been exculpated after killing a suspect in a higher rate of people of color. Representative Shirley Weber, African-American Assembly member from San Diego, now the first African-American Secretary of State, recently appointed by Governor Newsom. She carried legislation and fought for 2 years to pass a change of the rules for the use of deadly force that can hold officers accountable to review and to criminal and civil penalties. And then finally, I'll just mention AB 1869 by my good friend Holly Mitchell from Los Angeles. She recently elected to the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, had served as our budget chair in the state Senate. And that bill sought to end the system of fees against people who have gone through the criminal justice system and then are held accountable for the court costs, and they can't get a driver's license, they can't register to vote if they have these outstanding court fees from the so-called administration of justice. Holly Mitchell put forth witnesses showing that that was a law that got implemented in a manner that had a disparate adverse impact on people of color, and now no longer can somebody be held to pay the court fees as they go through the criminal justice system. The final comment on that, Nathaniel, some of those bills that I've described were brought to the Assembly or the Senate by members of minority caucuses, the Legislative Black Caucus, the Latino Legislative Caucus, the Asia Pacific Islander Caucus. These are minority caucuses along with the Women's Caucus that are formed within the state legislature, who bring forth from the communities they represent, and more broadly, sometimes replicating what's been done in other states, often pioneering in this state what is replicated in other states. And because of their unique experience and the communities they represent, are providing ever more impactful leadership within our policymaking bodies. And that's a direct result of activating people to become registered to vote, and to elect people from communities, often underrepresented communities in our political process. So that's part of the change that we're all part of as Black Lives Matter pushes electeds for law reform. We can point to the direct result. And my final comment there, we can pass laws, they're hard fought, but once we pass that law, it's still up to the people to make sure it's enforced, whether it's by local authorities, state authorities, or federal authorities. The passage of the law is really the first step towards the implementation of law reform designed to bring more equality to our communities and justice.
Thank you, Bill. You mentioned the new administration. In regard to this new administration, I am impressed by their actions towards a more, sorry, I think someone's speaking.
Somebody needs to mute. Okay, keep going. I don't know where that was from.
It's all good. In regards to the new administration, I am impressed by their actions towards a more diverse cabinet, faculty, and staff. Many white, Black, and brown folks believe Biden to be the vanguard of the political hierarchy. I hope for the best, but I am not a person who waits for a savior, especially a white one. I have the mentality that if you do it yourself. Right now, I feel like the U.S. is undoing the previous administration's policies. However, I look forward to new and innovative policies being created. The U.S. seems to be playing chess with itself. We move forward just to go back to protect what was. I'm saying this, hey, Eva, I think you're unmuted. I'm saying this because I'm personally, on the streets every day. Sometimes police chiefs call me because some of my fellow activist colleagues are out, causing good trouble, as Sean Lewis would say, advocating that police officers get to know police officers get to know their community instead of pull guns and weapons on individuals. I've personally been called to Seaside at one point to, I guess, calm down a protest. I remember when the NAACP of Monterey County called my cell phone and told me to come down to Seaside. And when I came down there, every single law enforcement agency on the peninsula was in tactical and SWAT gear. I'm not kidding you, Bill. My wife was right beside me, and I felt like I was in a movie. I was like, I can't believe this is happening. It made me start thinking, wow, this is a MLK or something type of moment, because they're looking to me for answers of what to do. And it was a huge opportunity, but it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been that. I looked at the officer in charge at the time, because Judy Veloz was doing something else. She's the one that called me to the scene. And I said, why are you in tactical gear? Why aren't you making sure you help the protesters? Don't act like you want confrontation. You're supposed to be the servants, the community servants to your city. And they just looked at me like, this is why you're here. Granted, I have not been here long. I moved here April 2019. So I get to Seaside, I see Ian Oglesby, Reverend Harold Lusk. They're trying to calm down their people. They're not listening to them. I saw a whole bunch of young, Black, brown, white folks angry about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, and Ahmaud Arbery. And so I spoke. We eventually marched. I had the officers clear out everything. So I wanted to calm everybody down. Show, like I said, negotiate, demonstrate, resist. I told them that we will get what we need done. You do it through the city council meetings. I'm not a person that just protests. I'm in every city council meeting in this city. People know my name because I show up. I kick down doors. And I hope that the new administration will be doing that. Yes, it's great that our federal government can put things out there and say things, but you're absolutely right when you're saying that it should start from a local level. But I personally think that the Biden administration should be creating some sort of task force where they implement into the local and state and make sure things are actually happening after they enforce things at Washington, D.C. Because there's a lot of law enforcement officers that with high school diplomas, they don't have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. Here in California, they get paid $85,000 plus. So we should be making sure these officers are well educated. And that in the teaching field, we should be making sure that our kids are being appropriately educated in high school, elementary all the way to high school. So when they apply to college, they're not behind. I remember when I was in undergraduate school in Missouri, I was sadly behind all of my white colleagues and counterparts, not because I could not handle the academic rigor of undergraduate school, but because my high schools that I went to did not do as well as they should have. And my background that I grew up in did not teach me what I should have known naturally. So yeah, what do you think about the Biden administration and how will they heal this country? I mean, words are amazing. I mean, Joe Biden is just like Barack Obama in the way he can talk to both sides, but we truly do need healing, and we need healing in not just in words but in action.
Well, thank you, Nathaniel. I just first want to acknowledge your role in many local communities in Monterey County, and I know it's taken you to other counties as well, and I believe is just part of your continued trajectory to making a difference that you're going to continue to make. I believe that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the first African-American woman, a woman of African-American and Asian descent, to be next in line for the presidency of the most powerful nation in the world. It's reflective of the hopes and aspirations of many. It goes beyond symbolism. This is a woman who grew up in Oakland and who served as a district attorney and then a state attorney general. And with the Biden administration, the appointments that are being made, they're not symbolic. Well, they're important symbols of diversity, but he's appointing people who are the best and the brightest to lead different agencies. And that is translating also into early policy proposals from the COVID stimulus discussions going on right now, which still currently incorporate raising the minimum wage nationally, which is another tragic truth of this nation as one of the richest in the world with the greatest economic divide between haves and have-nots. The Biden message of healing, while it's words, they are words that this country needs to hear from the highest office in the land. And it should be seen as a challenge to all of us. What's our role in fulfilling that vision or those words? I think Joe Biden would be the first to say he doesn't have the power, the authority, the wherewithal to make these changes, but he can focus on where we need to attend in healing our nation and building it up, and not just a return to the past, because we have a past that is not one we want to return to. We want to build on a fractured past and address the issues that gave rise to systemic racism in our nation. One of the areas in education that I didn't mention, but you prompted it, Nathaniel, talking about your own educational upbringing and disparities rooted in that, is the introduction of ethnic studies at younger and younger ages. The first ethnic studies I was privileged to participate in was when I was at Berkeley in college. Now we've passed along in California that it will be mandatory at the high school level, and there's a push to make it younger. The younger, the better, in my view, of understanding all cultures and cultural diversity, and heralding the good of different cultures in the models of people working together. Many of these struggles have deep roots, and you identified some of the people who you found inspirational: Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, along with Martin Luther King. I was in Berkeley at a time of, I mentioned earlier, the prison movement of very courageous inmates challenging solitary confinement, abuse of inmates at all levels of the prison system, and standing up, and many being severely punished or killed for that resistance. The Black Panther Party was vilified by J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the FBI, who said that Black Panthers posed the biggest threat to the security of this nation. And yet, when I look at what the Black Panthers represented in the Bay Area, they were running free breakfast programs in Oakland, free after-school childcare programs, GED equivalent training for people that are coming out of prison who had never gotten a high school equivalency. They were providing services that the system was not providing to those communities. And so for many, the Black Panther Party represented a social organization that was attending to the needs of the people. Yet they were vilified because of their militant stance standing against police brutality. Monterey County has a rich and sordid history, from the treatment of Native Americans to farm worker immigrant communities exposed to pesticides, very dangerous working conditions, and then police brutality in Monterey County that led to the building by the NAACP, the National Lawyers Guild, LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, working in concert, bringing together different progressive organizations, not around a nationalist call, but around a response to systemic mistreatment. Charles Vaughn Sr., a graduate of the then Monterey Institute of International Studies, a father in Seaside, a school teacher who suffered from schizophrenia and who was shot down by two Seaside police who invaded his apartment based on reports that he had gone off his meds, and he was shot down in cold blood. And there was a civil settlement for the family, but no justice. That led Mel Mason of the NAACP, myself with the National Lawyers Guild, representatives of LULAC and others, the ACLU, to join together to appeal to the Monterey County Board of Supervisors. This would have been back in the mid-1990s, late 1990s, for mandatory crisis intervention training for all uniformed police officers, meaning training that when you come upon a circumstance when somebody's clearly suffering from a mental illness, a mental breakdown, some stress-related play out, that you engage mental health experts in helping bring that person to the treatment, the care that they need, and not meeting it with force and violence. And yet some of those programs that we pioneered in Monterey County suffer and don't get continued because of funding issues. So when people say cut funding to the police, I think the translation for me is let's prioritize our law enforcement budgets to invest in more training, as you said, for law enforcement. The U.S. has the lowest training requirements of any advanced nation for its police officers. Many other countries, they have to have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree and much longer training. In the U.S., the path to a badge is too short, in my view. And I'll pause there, Nathaniel, turn it back to you. But there's much history that gets forgotten if it doesn't get repeated and doesn't get shared. And those who have written the history books have systematically excluded the stories mostly of minority communities, and that's part of systemic racism as well. Children not seeing themselves reflected in the history books, the inventions as we honor Black History Month, the many inventions brought to the world by African American scientists, engineers, innovators. In this, not just this month, but every month, we should be recognizing those collective contributions. So I'll pause there. I don't know if I answered your question, but you got me going.
No, I love it. I love it. You know, this is what it's about, to have these conversations, and we're moving towards more integrative spaces, and we're mentioning law enforcement, things like that. And I actually come from a law enforcement background. You know, I'm not just a guy speaking from the outside. I was trained at 14 until 18, interestingly, by the FBI, CIA, and DEA, along with local law enforcement officers in something called the Explorer program in Shelby County, Alabama, where every summer we did a police academy. It was military style. They were teddy bears before, and then during the academy, they turned into our worst nightmares. And you know, I personally thought I was going to be in law enforcement. I was a corrections officer during my entire undergraduate degree, along with doing foster care work and things like that. When the breaks happened, I was working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. as a corrections officer, and first African American at the Polk County Sheriff's Office. Hired. The current governor of Missouri was literally was the sheriff of that agency before I had gotten there, just maybe a few months. Roy Blunt, as a lot of people know, is one of the top Republican senators. He was one of my presidents of the university I studied at in undergraduate school. And I'm bringing this up because I see the benefits of where law enforcement could go if it was structured correctly. We have to get away from the historical standpoints of how law enforcement was. We all know that law enforcement was at one point a slave catching unit in the South, and in the northern parts, it was to oppress the lower income people, to help the rich. I was taught this in undergraduate school. It's embarrassing because the main reasons that maybe pushed me towards Middlebury Institute of International Studies was because I was sitting at the same department in Alabama after the Peace Corps, thinking I was just going to become a law enforcement officer to help my community in a better way, and that way move up the ranks and do things like that. And I remember seeing an interview, and the officer who said, "Nathaniel, you realize that you're not going to change anything if you join us. You know," he's like, "We don't change the system, we assimilate to it." And I looked at myself, and I had these battles. This is what African American men and women have to go through. Do we join or do we fight against it? And so I was like, man, I could have in Alabama $80,000 salary, you know, at the younger age, Nathaniel, and live pretty well and still be me, but in a different way. But I don't know, something just wouldn't let me do it. So now I've had to leave so many amazing opportunities because it doesn't fit with my ethical core of me. And so, you know, moving towards more integrative spaces, how do we move towards the future to a more integrative US, where a future Nathaniel, a younger generation Nathaniel, can feel confident about joining a law enforcement agency and not feel like they're betraying their people, you know? Because if my kids one day say, "Hey, Dad, I know you're a Black Lives Matter guy, but I really am wanting to be a cop. But I think, I would love for things to be changed by then, you know?"
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think it's a ongoing struggle just on law enforcement when people of color aspire to those positions, and their motivation is to serve the communities they come from, and perhaps with a more even hand or a better ability to listen and understand. And yet they face discrimination often within those departments, as well as misunderstanding and abuse from the people they're hoping to serve. So it's really complicated. In those positions, it exposes the complexity in the multiple layers of race and racism in workplaces, in society, particularly in law enforcement. But as we move forward, I think it's important, particularly for allies, to understand that saying you're blind to race, as people will say that, and to me it exposes ignorance when they say, I think we live in a post-racial society. It exposes an ignorance of not having walked in the shoes or lived the lives of people of color who on a daily, regular basis will face either explicit or subtle racism as they navigate the days in their lives. How do we move forward to build more integrated, respectful communities of understanding and mutual respect? And how do you do that when you have people who are waving Confederate flags and yelling racial epithets? And how does a young child growing up in that atmosphere develop a sense of hope, a sense of trust for the other? A lot of it in peacemaking is breaking down enemy images. We enforce stereotypes often to get people to continue in patterns of behavior that benefit the economy or benefit a dominant power or whatever it might be. In my experience in negotiation, cross-cultural and international negotiation, we convened sessions in Amman, Jordan, where we brought Israeli students and Palestinian students together. And the first few days of being together, they stayed in their own camps and viewed the other as the enemy, as they had always seen the other as the enemy, as their oppressor or as the enemy. But it was through the cultural and human exchange, not just in the classrooms, but people going out to clubs together in the evening and starting to see the other, not as the stereotypic other, but as Ahmad or as Hillel, or, learning them by name as people. And the power of negotiation is getting people to sit at a table of mediation and to hear the other and what they feel, what they've experienced. But you have to manifest some will that seeks change or that seeks resolution. And that's often the bigger challenge. In my view, working as a mediator, if we have people at the table who are looking for a solution, we're more than halfway there. We won't solve every problem, but we'll have a 75, 80% chance of reaching some solution. The challenge is getting people to manifest that will to look for a solution, to work with each other, and translating that model of a mediation table to our communities. I believe it is through our schools and our educational system. Those have been historically the place where children meet the other, whatever that is in their life experience. And the quicker we can move towards integration in education, building human relationships that don't discount historic disparities and racism, but which create the healing avenues for dialogue, understanding. But that's hard even in education when you have communities that are divided by wealth, by haves and have-nots, and by economic segregation that makes educational integration that much tougher. But I'll pause there, Nathaniel. I know at some point we're going to start enlisting questions or comments from others, but I defer to you. You're leading the conversation here.
No, I think it's an equal amount. But yeah, if someone has some questions that they want to ask us or Bill in particular, please start putting them in the chat, and someone eventually will maybe let us know what those questions are, or, and we can do that. But Bill, you mentioned educators and the haves and have-nots, and I do want to say that I hope that one day that we realize that sometimes the haves are teaching the have-nots, and the haves have to make sure they understand where the have-nots are coming from.
Well, and that's where the haves have to become students, and we have to create the forums like this today, where and build and expand on that to realize a strength that one person may bring to a table and it's viewed as a weakness in somebody else, what are the paradigms that can be flipped and switched, where I as a teacher can learn from a student. A student comes to a classroom to learn, but I believe the best teachers are those who also are constantly learning from their students, being pushed by their students to open up, to challenge convention, and build that type of dynamic into whatever the subject matter is, that empowers the student and also empowers the teacher. How do we take that model out into our neighborhoods?
It's perfect. Looks like we have a question. How do you want to do this? Eva, do you want to ask it, or would you like me to read it?
I'll help you out with it and ask the question, just so that if more are coming while you're talking, it makes it easier for you. So I think this is to you, Bill, because you mentioned the peace and reconciliation process in South Africa. Lou Basarski is wondering, how could that transfer to the US, and what kind of process could you imagine to aim to bridge the blue-red divide?
Well, it's a great question, and I'd be the first to acknowledge there's not a South African blueprint that could just be transferred, but I think we can be inspired by and learn from a national commitment to bring people together who in the past have been divided. Translating this into the United States, and with our current blue-red divide, that if anything has become more exacerbated as the extreme right has become in some fashion legitimized as now the core of the Republican Party in our two-party system. There's been a legitimization by the last administration of white supremacists as being a respectable voice or a legitimate voice in our body politic. And I think it needs to be rejected. And that's not a comment that leads to reconciliation necessarily. That said, I think if we transcend the power elites of the Republican Party and even of the Democratic Party or the governmental infrastructure, the best place that we can make a difference in approximating a truth and reconciliation process probably starts in our local communities, and it's probably led by academic, nonpartisan institutions that create the space for people to come together, and both the space in a voluntary sense, but maybe with some facilitation, and then in a more structured or formal sense, maybe in our schools and classrooms, where as part of education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, there's also cultural understanding, ethnic studies, cross-cultural dialogue that allows people a safe space to talk about how they've been hurt or how they've perhaps been identified with an oppressor class or an oppressor race, and get it on the table so people can start the process of openness, of discussion and understanding. I'll just conclude by saying, I think the challenge in opening that process is, since there's not a blueprint or a guaranteed end point, it does require skilled facilitation to keep people moving in a direction that, even though it may be painful and hard, is designed to have a shared objective of healing and moving to a better place. Not to mean it's going to be kumbaya as we go through it, nor should it be. By that, I mean not just all love and good vibes. The process of healing is going to require sharing hurtful experiences and painful experiences. But to me, that's the beginning point, and educational institutions, community organizations should start modeling it now and encouraging governments to support it and replicate it in the halls of government as well.
Raider, you had your hand raised. Maybe you would just unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a couple quick points. I've read once, I think the Washington Post or something, maybe a year ago, about violent or political extremism is often tied to toxic masculinity. And that really tracks with my experience. I have some ties to white nationalist extremists that are in jail now. So that's just something to think about, especially for educators at the young level, I think, and could be a particularly powerful way to kind of, to both Nathaniel and Bill's points about breaking down the other, and also to, I think it really starts with the ability to dehumanize others, and that happens really young. And so these really rigid gender roles, I think, play a part in making it easier to dehumanize someone else for things. And then my question is, like I said, I've ties to political extremism. My family's some of the most racist people I've ever met. I'm from Kansas, and trying to think of solutions. Both Bill and Nathaniel mentioned a lot of great ideas, but I still really worry that, is there a way in this two political party system, essentially Republicans, or the GOP, I should say, have an incentive to disallow others to vote to maintain power. And if we start educating people that that's immoral or incorrect, they also lose power. And so I think there's really strong incentives for them to fight tooth and nail. And I'm really already stressing about arguing with people at school board meetings about the 1776 project or something similar. Is there a way to get change done with this two-party system, or should our focus be maybe trying to take down some of those incentives that allow to a two-party system, and then allow one party to maintain power has to delegitimize and disenfranchise the other side? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll try to take it in. I know Bill might have some, because me and Bill kind of have had in the past a little bit of division on some things because I'm younger, and I have been a part of the Democratic Party as a vice president here in the Monterey Peninsula. But I also have moved towards more independent avenues where, a lot of politicians like Bill be like, no, Nathaniel, don't steer away from your roots, your Democratic roots and things like that, because we are fighting for you. But I hear what you're saying with that, because I've seen the divisions in the Democratic and Republican Party, and that's just being fair. They fight with each other tooth to nail on national television, and it hurts people psychologically and traumatically. And that's why I want to study further in the clinical psychology fields, because I personally feel like when African Americans and now Latinx are going to have something called, or it's a new field called post-traumatic slave syndrome, where I'm going to really go into that later in the future. But Caucasian people, if you really think about it, and this is just coming from my perspective, a lot of low-income Caucasian folks have the same issues as Black and Brown community. If you really know your history, the Black Panther Party actually had white supremacists in their, they got white supremacists in their party, and they fought tooth and nail with each other as a unit, because they realized their fight wasn't against each other, it was against their situation. And so right now, what I personally see is a narrative change, where there is powers that be that are trying to make sure that the racism of before, that was really, really in your face, call you different names, drink at the different water fountains, all that, they're trying to bring that back. And you saw it a little bit in the Trump administration. A lot of people were coming out of their caves, people that were raised by their great grandparents and taught that the stuff that they were taught at their homes, you started hearing it. And I personally feel like the way to fight that is through these type of avenues where Middlebury Institute of International Studies is doing, but also bringing different cultures together through some sort of events. Of music is powerful, sports is powerful. We have to get back to really like combining with each other and just being okay with being different. And I think that's gonna take the new generation. It's sad to say this for my older folks, but the older folks are they're eventually going to have to, let the new generation come in and let their voices be heard. But Bill, go ahead and give your sense.
Yeah, great. No, I appreciate that framing and the question from Raider. I want to key off just what he said right up front about toxic masculinity. And I think we do have to look at gender politics, and how men are raised in this country is also part of our challenge as informed and conscious communities. How we raise young boys and young girls to look at each other and stereotyped roles, which have been breaking down. I think, and to key off something Nathaniel said, I think the younger generation has shown in the electoral arena, younger people are less judgmental of LGBTQ community, more accepting of LGBTQ queer culture as kids they've grown up with, kids they've known, or who may be them, and less judgmental in terms of inclusion, kind of on that level of gender stereotypes and gender history. On the more explicit political arena, the electoral arena, I know Nathan and I have gone back and forth on this a little bit. He alluded to it. There's a sentiment among some young people, well, damn both the parties. Neither one has solved the problems that continue to persist. And I push back because I see, and I'm partisan, but I see a qualitative difference between a party that has now become a refuge for white supremacists. When you look at their convention, it's predominantly, if not exclusively, white, and they're giving license and empowerment to those who are sharing the vestiges of the Confederacy, of an enslaved society, and they're normalizing that. They're trying to normalize that here in 2021 versus a Democratic Party that is not without imperfection, but has been the party of inclusion, that has elected the first African-American woman of South Asian descent to the second highest office in the land. And if you just look at the vote in Georgia, in the election of two Democrats to tip the balance of power in the US Senate, that now might allow for the appointment and confirmation of progressive people of color to run government agencies, that has the prospect of immigration reform for the first time in decades. Why? Because people were encouraged to vote in Georgia, they were empowered to vote, and they had to overcome voter suppression, which is the new card of the Republican Party. If everybody votes, we lose. If we can suppress the vote, we can hold power. So politics, which is ultimately the practice of policy making and designing our communities in its best form, it is the exercise, it's the development and exercise of power. And to suggest that the two parties are basically similar or both defective, to me, displays a dangerous ignorance that will empower that further erosion of people being able to vote, being able to see themselves in elected office. And so we're in the fight for our lives, I think, and it's playing out in many different arenas. But the electoral franchise, we are going to, in these next 2 years, see bold initiatives to take away voting rights, to limit voting rights, to require on-site identification, facial scans, fingerprinting. It's happening. This is not theoretical. And then the pushback to give people their franchise the simple right to vote that's been thwarted and disrupted and blocked. So I mean, Nathaniel and I are in agreement on 95% of, I think, how we look at many issues. And I think there's convergence on our sense of the importance of political empowerment of people. I served as the majority leader in the state Senate. That was a partisan political position, and my responsibility allowed me to move policy in the state legislature that got signed into law. Why? Because we did the work in our neighborhoods, we won the votes, we tallied the votes, and we won the precious right to cast a vote. I passed a bill, Senate Bill 200, that will bring $1.3 billion into disadvantaged communities, $1.3 billion to reconstruct water systems that currently people can't drink safe, clean drinking water in the state of California, over 1 million people. This is a critical public health crisis, and through democratic leadership and people voting, we've been able to reorient a huge portion of the state budget to attend to the needs of people who historically have been disenfranchised and had no political voice in the poorest communities in the state of California. That's political power, and that's its use and an example that enhances a fundamental human right, a public health right to safe, clean drinking water. So there's all kinds of examples like that. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And because the audience is also international and people that'll be working in the international arena, a lot of these lessons we're talking about is kind of a parochial look at the United States and its underbelly and its history of racism and exclusion and brutality. There's examples all over the world. And the more we can unite people, not just in our communities, but internationally, to share common cause and common purpose to uplift the human condition, that's the ultimate test, in my view, of a Middlebury education in launching the next generation of policymakers and human rights activists.
So we have a question that's sort of on the politics side, whether it was a political miscalculation to call the effort to reallocate financial resources defund the police. And if so, what alternative could be used to get more support for that movement?
Nathaniel, you want to take the lead? I'm glad to comment. You want me to lead off?
No, I got this.
Okay.
I have a lot of colleagues who created something called Community Before Cops here on the Central Coast. And there's some other activist events, and they started using that term, defund the police. And there's some local politicians that start saying that as well. And my issues with it, and I only said this to my colleagues and people in general, and I put it out on Facebook, is that when you use terms like defund the police, you're automatically going to get a lot of backlash, and people aren't going to understand what you're coming from. My thing is that coming from a human security, human development standpoint, I believe that there should be social workers, psychologists, counselors, things like that in law enforcement. I remember I was talking to some law enforcement officers here, and even in different states, Missouri and Alabama in particular, and they said that, Nate, we don't go to counseling. We don't go to therapy. We see dead bodies on a regular basis. Sometimes we have to use our gun. It's paperwork. That's it. These social workers, counselors, all these different expert people in their expertise don't need to necessarily just be in the community walking with the officer or going to a domestic violence dispute or going to the homeless call. So they need to be talking to the law enforcement officers. Defund the police, to me, it's meant in the right way from the people that tried to create that term and empower it, but it should be turned and twisted into something better for people to understand. Bill, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I echo what you said, Nathaniel. I believe it came from a place of great pain and great loss after the very public killing, not just of George Floyd, but others, that the abuse of police power resulting in the killing of unarmed people of color, it was, why should we fund you if you're going to kill people in our community? And yet I think it's provoked important conversation that's helped to surface some of the things Nathaniel alluded to about the prioritization of how we invest in our local security, domestic security. You can really expand this to international security too. Are we made safer by funding more nuclear weapons development? Or what if those billions of dollars were invested in programs of social uplift, of feeding hungry children, of supporting refugee communities? It's a question of prioritization. And do we invest in the human condition, or do we respond to fear and militarized not only internationally our armies, but we've brought in that type of militarization to our local police with investing in SWAT squads and surplus military vehicles. There was a school in Los Angeles that was getting surplus military equipment for their police, the local school district police in LA, that included grenade launchers that were being stored in a janitor's closet. I carried legislation that would require a school board to vote before a school district was able to acquire any military surplus equipment. It didn't prohibit it. It just said, let's put this out in the public, make sure parents know what's going on, make sure students know what's going on, and let the people we elected have a vote in whether we want grenade launchers in the janitor's closet. It's a true example. Or would we rather invest that money in more school books or laptop computers, or upgrading our school buses to be carbon neutral? So it is ultimately a discussion of priorities, but I think the defund the police, as much as it rubbed many people the wrong way, we have to understand the deep pain and loss that provoked that response.
Eva, before you go to the next question, I want to add to that is that if you are going to a domestic violence situation, would you rather have a law enforcement a person with a gun coming to you to their main mission is to arrest the person who's causing the most chaos or trouble? Or would you rather have a social worker or some sort of therapist come to your home with the law enforcement officer be outside, and the therapist talk to the two individuals and give them their card, and they start having regular counseling? If it's something that's not serious, have regular counseling, and even anger management therapy and all those type of things. Again, officers here in California make $85,000 plus a year with a high school diploma, and they 6 months of training to carry a gun in the community and pretty much do whatever you want in the community as long as you write your paperwork every day. Things do need to change in that arena. So I definitely understand my colleagues that do say defund the police, because that money could be relocated to other nonprofits or into their own departments and hiring better qualified staff members. Thank you.
Thank you. So Betty is asking about fake news. How do you have a conversation with someone who just believes lies, or you are not talking about the same reality? How do you bridge that gap?
I'll take a stab at that first and hand off to Nathaniel. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of our time, of the modern era. And again, I will not refrain from pointing fingers. I think the past administration did more to legitimize and build upon and create fake news, to distract and disorient and push messages, that to now we have a sector of the population who depend upon news sources that are providing debunked false information. Use the elections as an example, certified by independent state bodies that certify our elections by state and then reviewed by the courts. And in each step of the way, no evidence of fraud or abuse. And yet we have the former president himself picking up a phone and trying to get a Secretary of State to fix the vote. And yet that's not perceived as interference with our electoral system. But to the heart of the question, how do you engage in principled dialogue with a counterpart who is embracing false news sources as truth, has integrated those as the truth, and they believe it is their belief that is true? So I think while it is tough to listen to that and not just react negatively or critically, the old negotiation technique of listening, and we call negotiation jujitsu, you draw them out, you let them make their statement that may sound absurd, and you follow it not by countering with, you're wrong, that's not right, you know, how could you believe that? You counter by saying, well, let me make sure I understand that. And you keep drawing them out with more questions. And where did you learn that? And what was the basis for that information? And is that a source that I could look at and understand? And if I looked at that, would you be willing to look at some of the sources that I've read about the credibility of that source? But it's the hardest challenge we face right now, because what used to be seen as a fringe of false conspiracy theories is been given almost mainstream legitimization, again, by members of the far right, by white supremacists, by conspiracy theorists who advance their cause based on deceit and conscious deceit of the people that are following. I don't know, maybe I think that's an inadequate response, but maybe Nathaniel's got another idea of how to come at that.
No, honestly, it's a great response. I've had to learn to say the same things. Hey, where did you get your information? Could you send me a source so I can read it? Here's my source. I've learned to not argue with people because you're not going to win those. You have to find civil ways to make them feel like they're being heard, but also educate while you're doing it. It's a growing process for me, honestly. I'm 27 years old, so I'm sure what I say at 27 will be different at 40, at 50, at 60, you know? So yeah, that's all I have to say to that right now.
Thank you. We have some questions about policies. I hear an echo in myself. Like the war on drugs policy that caused a lot of harm, especially to people of color, I would say. There's also a lot of talk in the community about other old policies that you could say helped white people get ahead economically and marginalized other communities. How do we correct these things? And should we be thinking about reparations and other ways to correct some of the wrongs? Because it's not enough for many people to start today doing the right thing. You also have to look to the past and help fix things, make them better moving forward that way.
Hey, Bill, you're muted.
Okay, I think I was muted. So I'll just take a crack at the outset and hand it to Nathaniel. But on the reparations piece, I talked about truth and reconciliation, about processes of bringing people together and trying to start processes that are healing. Although painful, they could be healing. We have in the California legislature looked at reparations. Again, Shirley Weber from San Diego, now our Secretary of State, first African-American woman to sit as our Secretary of State, introduced legislation supported by the Black Legislative Caucus and other members that would have the state of California support a federal approach to reparations, as well as a state approach to reparations. And for those, just to be clear, reparations translates to some type of monetary or economic payment in reparation, in recognition of past harm caused. And while there's no dollar amount, in my view, that could compensate a family that has suffered directly or generationally from the loss of a loved one through enslavement or lynching or mass incarceration or loss of land, part of reparations for me is another R word, which is recognition. Reparations equals recognition and is recognition and can be seen as tantamount perhaps to an apology that again is part of a process of healing and moving forward. So I think I'll just pause there on the reparation piece, and Nathaniel, feel free to pick up on that, or there was other elements to the question as well.
Yeah, I hear the conversation on reparations a lot, along with the war on drugs, mainly because in growing up, the African American community in Alabama and now in California, because I talk to a lot of leaders here too, they all talk about how their community was destroyed by drugs, you know, and no one tried to correct it in any type of way. And personally, for me, as an African American, I can only speak for me, and hopefully it helps ripple to someone, plants a seed in someone's mind or in skill set to make it so. But reparations, yes, it's monetary, but there's so much more. There's education. I personally don't feel like African Americans or Latino, like I can only speak for African Americans right now. I can't speak for anybody else when I say that I don't think that we should be getting student loans right now with being how oppressed we've been for centuries. You're pretty much saying, okay, we're going to allow you to go to college, but we're going to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. So I know you just came from low income situations and all your family or some of your families are illiterate and come from slaves, but we're going to give you a whole bunch of debt, and then hopefully you'll be able to go into the job market and people will hire you. You know, and that's one thing. Two, financial stability is so weak in the African American community. You can't just give us $10,000 and expect us to turn it into $1 million. You know what I mean? We need to be educated. We need the tools. Give us the tools first, and then we can start talking about reparations. We might not even need reparations if we have the tools.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that too, part of the connection with reparations is economic inequality that dates back generations to property ownership, to young people of color trying to afford a college education or carry debt when counterparts who have been the beneficiaries of accumulated wealth or property have more opportunity economically to select whether it's colleges, places to live, etc. I do want to comment briefly on the question on the war on drugs and drug policy. The war on drugs has been proven to be one of the most misdirected law enforcement initiatives ever, and it was implemented in a manner that put millions of dollars into law enforcement. Again, the militarization of police, the advent of SWAT squads and invasionary forces to go after alleged drug dealers, usually in underserved, disadvantaged communities. And it gave rise to a prison system in the state of California that built 19 new prisons during a decade when not a single University of California campus was built. 19 prisons versus 0 universities. And our prison population grew to over 200,000 in the state of California alone, and gave rise to the privatization of what we call the prison industrial complex. People at each step of the way of the war on drugs were profiteers in law enforcement, in manufacture of weapons, in manufacture of flak jackets, tanks, prisons, prison systems, etc. We've seen some of that being folded back in the look at unjust sentencing for victims of the drug war caught with powder cocaine versus those caught with crack cocaine, the distinction being the communities where those arrestees were basically the same substance, but going from a slap on the wrist to diversion to literally lifelong prison sentences, some of those being reversed in light of the retrospective. The opioid crisis is the more recent extension of the drug crisis or the war on drugs. The opioid crisis created by pharmaceuticals that were bent on excessive, unlimited profits at the expense of the health of our communities, and the carnage left behind, not just of dead bodies, but of ruined lives and torn families, is going to take decades to repair as well. Again, we talk about systemic racism the core of that term is system. What is the system that gives rise to these excesses of profiteering and exploitation and assaults on the public health of communities, the mental health of communities? Friends, we have to look at the system that is creating these injustices, these inequities, and advance fundamental systemic change, systemic reform. And in some cases, systemic reform is not enough. It has to be systemic change.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end. Elizabeth has posted some resources about reparations in the chat if anybody's interested. Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to end with a question that we got about what local organizations can a person here locally join if they're interested about these issues?
Yeah, my email, I'll give you just my student email for right now. It's Nathaniel S@middlebury.edu. I can get you in contact with Community Before Cops, the Monterey County NAACP, the locals, the many different small local Democratic clubs of Monterey Peninsula and the larger chain. But yeah, reach out to me and I can help you out with that. Bill?
Yeah, I would echo all of those sources that Nathaniel mentioned. I would also, I'm getting an echo now too. I would also direct people to the National Lawyers Guild website. It's a national organization of progressive lawyers, legal workers, and jailhouse lawyers. It was founded in 1937 to provide a bar association for people of color, which the American Bar Association did not permit admission to Black lawyers in 1937. It's one of the longest standing progressive legal organizations in the history of this country. National Lawyers Guild, nlg.org. And they have chapters around the country, including the Bay Area. But I mention that because they have a lot, they're front and center in some of these fights that we've been discussing and provide great resources. And then also the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, has a Monterey County branch. The ACLU has a Monterey County branch, the American Civil Liberties Union. I think Nathaniel mentioned those as well, but those would be a couple local resources. Most importantly, I would just kind of wrap up encouraging people to stay engaged in exploration of how does all this apply to us, and the us being whoever I am in this conversation. And if it's a graduate student at MIIS from the US, from a non-US nation, how does what we're talking about translate maybe to my life experience here in the US or in my home nation? And how do we advance a more revolutionary approach to human problem solving that's rooted in compassion, that's rooted in respect, and that looks towards building better communities, more respectful communities, and is not afraid to stand up against those forces that stand for the opposite. And again, maybe I'll just use this as kind of my close to thank Middlebury Institute and Nathaniel for initiating this. Thanks to Ava for the coordination, and Justin, and to the Dean for his leadership at MIIS and in the community. Thank you so much.
I would also like to say thank you to Eva, Jeff, Barbara, Bill, of course, and all the people that showed up and listened. This is where it starts. You can create your own organization. You don't sometimes have to look for them. There's a lot of organizations that are powerful now because they started just planting seeds. Thank you, Middlebury Institute, for giving us this opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And those are perfect words to end on. Thank you all for coming. And we will be sending out some more information about the next teach-in. But this was a wonderful conversation. And like you said, Nathaniel, the seed, it has to start somewhere. Thank you.